Picture this scenario: 20 million barrels of oil every single day, flowing through a strip of water so narrow you could drive across it in 20 minutes. Now picture a single country, one regime, deciding on its own terms to shut that corridor down entirely. No warning, no negotiation, just silence, mines in the water, and fast attack craft circling in the dark. That is exactly what happened on February 28, 2026, when Iran effectively blockaded the Strait of Hormuz in retaliation for U.S. and Israeli military operations. In the span of days, tanker traffic collapsed by more than 90%. 3,000 vessels were stranded, 20,000 seafarers trapped, and roughly 27% of the world's seaborne crude oil trade vanished, just like that. But here's the problem. While the world watched the flames, while news cameras zoomed into the strait and oil markets spiraled into chaos, one country had already built the exit door, quietly, methodically, over years. And the moment the crisis hit, that door swung wide open. That country is Saudi Arabia. And what Riyadh has done, the triple logistical fortress it has constructed to completely sideline the Strait of Hormuz, is one of the most staggering geopolitical maneuvers of the 21st century. It is a masterwork of infrastructure, strategy, and patient power, executed without a single shot fired. To understand what Saudi Arabia built, you first need to understand what Iran tried to do. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran and Oman, 21 miles at its narrowest point. 2 shipping lanes, each barely 2 miles wide. Through those lanes passes roughly a quarter of the world's maritime crude oil trade, along with approximately 20% of global liquefied natural gas. Before the 2026 crisis, some 20 million barrels of oil per day moved through that choke point. China alone received a third of all its oil via this corridor. Europe sourced 12 to 14% of its LNG from Qatar through the same passage. This is where things change. Iran has long understood that this geography is its most powerful weapon. For decades, Tehran calibrated its threats around Hormuz the way a chess player positions a queen. Not always deployed, but always looming. The mere suggestion of closure sent oil prices surging. Insurance premiums for ships transiting the strait exploded in early 2026, rising from 0.125% to between 0.2% and 0.4% of vessel value per single transit. For a very large crude carrier, that translates to an increase of over $250,000 per crossing. And then Iran pulled the trigger for real. Following the US-Israeli strikes that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps declared the strait closed. They laid sea mines. They boarded merchant vessels. They struck tankers with drones. The Kuwaiti very large crude carrier Al Salami was hit while anchored at the port of Dubai. A Qatar energy tanker was attacked by projectiles north of Doha. On April 1st, the world's 3 largest container shipping lines, Maersk, CMA CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd, suspended Hormuz transits indefinitely. Approximately 170 container ships were trapped or restricted inside the Persian Gulf. Oil prices surged from roughly $70 per barrel to an average of $130 in March. This was Iran's weapon activated and working exactly as designed. Except for one thing: Saudi Arabia wasn't trapped. This is where most people miss it. On March 12, 2026, Saudi Transport Minister Saleh Al-Jasser walked into Jeddah Islamic Port and announced the Western Coast Logistics Corridors Initiative. This was not improvisation. This was not emergency scrambling. This was the detonation of a plan years in the making. An entire alternative geography for global trade, pre-built, pre-connected, and ready to absorb the shock that everyone else was unprepared for. What Riyadh had constructed is best understood as 3 distinct but interlocking weapons. 3 shields, 3 corridors, each one powerful on its own. Together they form a wall so complete that Iran's greatest trump card crumbles against it like paper. The first weapon is the global port network centered on Jeddah Islamic Port. As confirmed by the Saudi Ports Authority, known as Mawani, Jeddah Islamic Port is now directly connected to 9 major international ports spanning Asia, Europe, and beyond. Those connections include Tangshan, Qingdao, Ningbo, and Shanghai in China, Busan in South Korea, Tanjung Pelepas in Malaysia, and Singapore, with additional strategic hubs extending into the western and eastern Mediterranean, and routes reaching South Africa via the Cape of Good Hope. This is not a regional network. This is a full-spectrum global logistics web, and Jeddah sits at its center. But here's the problem. Let's pause on the China connection for a moment, because this is where the strategy cuts deepest. Beijing is, on paper, Tehran's most important economic partner. China has kept Iran afloat through years of sanctions, purchasing Iranian oil at steep discounts and providing diplomatic cover when needed. But here is the reality of how Beijing actually operates. The Chinese economy consumes enormous quantities of oil. Its factories require it to produce the electronics, automobiles, and industrial goods that fuel its export machine. Thousands of containers of goods must flow outward to Gulf markets every single day. A real, sustained Hormuz closure is not a geopolitical abstraction for Beijing. It is a dagger into the heart of the Chinese industrial economy. So when Saudi Arabia built direct maritime links to Shanghai, Qingdao, Ningbo, and the rest, bypassing Hormuz completely, China did not hesitate. It quietly, pragmatically stepped right through the door Riyadh opened. Analysts describe this as a structural shift in Middle East logistics, as Chinese trade flows begin routing away from dependence on the Persian Gulf corridor altogether. China stated publicly that the conflict should not have started, and criticized Iran for attacking regional neighbors, appointing distance from its supposed strategic partner in Tehran. The geopolitical arithmetic here is brutal for Iran. Its most valuable ally, the one it counts on most for economic survival, is simultaneously building logistics infrastructure specifically designed to make Iran irrelevant. Beijing is placing its bet on Riyadh, not Tehran. This is where things change. And with Saudi Arabia now positioned as the primary entry point for Asian goods into the Gulf region, that bet only grows larger with each passing month. Then there are the Japanese connections. Kobe, Nagoya, Yokohama, directly linked to Saudi ports. Japan's strategic petroleum reserves stand at approximately 16 million tons. Tokyo has always been acutely vulnerable to Persian Gulf disruptions. Its entire industrial economy runs on imported energy. A secure line to Saudi Arabia's Red Sea ports is not just economically convenient for Japan, it is a national security imperative. With the Hormuz threat now proven to be a real, executable strategy and not merely theoretical blackmail, the Japanese administration has every incentive to deepen these connections. Saudi Arabia, in effect, just made itself indispensable to Japan's energy survival. That is leverage of the highest order. On the European end of the network, Southampton in the United Kingdom, Rotterdam in the Netherlands, Hamburg in Germany, the industrial hearts of Europe. These connections ensure that heavy European manufacturing, automotive, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, no longer depends on the geopolitical temper of the mullahs in Tehran to maintain its supply chains. European governments have welcomed this with what one would describe as profound relief. Saudi Red Sea ports are already performing roles far beyond simple export. They are becoming regional distribution centers for Asian goods heading to the Middle East and Africa, stimulating the growth of logistics services, storage, handling, and distribution across the kingdom. What happens next? Jeddah Islamic Port is not simply large. After an $800 million South Container Terminal expansion completed in 2025, it handles approximately 7.5 million TEUs annually. Saudi Arabia's Red Sea ports collectively possess an annual capacity exceeding 18.6 million TEUs. In June 2025 alone, export containers surged 17.79% year-on-year, while import containers grew 10.68%. Much of this capacity was historically underutilized. The Hormuz crisis changed that overnight. Officials projected a 50% surge in port arrivals within 2 weeks of the crisis beginning in March 2026. And as Saudi Aramco confirmed to buyers, the oil giant is now redirecting crude oil exports to load from Yanbu on the Red Sea coast instead of Gulf terminals. This is Aramco, the world's most powerful oil producer, publicly pivoting its entire export geography westward. That statement alone tells you everything you need to know about the permanence of this shift. Now let's talk about the second weapon, because the 9-port global network is just the beginning. On May 3, 2026, MSC, the world's largest container shipping company, announced a brand new hybrid route directly connecting Europe to the Gulf, completely bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. The first vessel on this service departed from Antwerp on May 10th, with stops in Germany, Italy, Lithuania, and Spain. The ship sails through the Suez Canal into the Red Sea, stopping at Jeddah and King Abdullah ports on Saudi Arabia's western coast. This is where most people miss it, but here is where it becomes brilliant. Here is where the engineering audacity of this project truly reveals itself. At King Abdullah Port in Jeddah, the cargo does not continue by sea. It is offloaded, transferred to enormous truck fleets waiting on the highways. These trucks then traverse the full breadth of Saudi Arabia, roughly 1,300 kilometers across the desert, from the western coast through the capital Riyadh, all the way to the city of Dammam on the eastern Saudi coast. From there, smaller feeder vessels distribute cargo through the Persian Gulf to Kuwait, Bahrain, and the UAE's ports in Abu Dhabi and beyond. The entire system is tracked in real time by satellite. Giant autonomous crane systems move containers at Jeddah and King Abdullah with precision. A logistics park of 415,000 square meters at Jeddah is set for completion by mid-2026. Key cranes at the facility are being expanded from 14 to 22 units. This is not improvised trucking. This is a high-security, technology-driven transcontinental bridge, purpose-built for exactly this scenario. MSC said in its statement that the route is designed to provide reliable, efficient, and competitive shipping options with improved transit times for all types of cargo: automotive parts, consumer electronics, pharmaceuticals, food products, all flowing through Saudi territory without touching a single drop of water under Iranian control. The significance of MSC choosing this route cannot be overstated. When the world's largest container shipping company commits its vessels and its brand to a new trade corridor, it sends an unmistakable signal to every manufacturer, every retailer, every logistics manager on Earth. This route is real, it is viable, and it is where global trade is going. Iran's ability to weaponize Hormuz just became dramatically less effective against container trade. But here's the problem. In choosing Saudi Arabia as its land bridge, MSC is effectively endorsing Riyadh's vision of itself as a three-continent hub. A vote of confidence from the most powerful private logistics actor on Earth. Robert Mogul-Nicky, founder of Polosphere Advisory, a Middle East-focused geoeconomic consultancy based in Paris, told the South China Morning Post that these structural shifts, started by necessity, will not necessarily fully stop even once the immediate crisis resolves. The infrastructure is being built, the routes are being opened, the relationships are being established. Even if Hormuz reopens tomorrow, the global logistics map has already begun to redraw itself. And Riyadh sits at the new center of gravity. Now for the third weapon, the one that has been quietly operational for decades. The one that proves this was never just a reaction to the 2026 crisis. It was always part of a longer, deeper Saudi strategic vision. Its name is Petroline, the east-west crude oil pipeline, and it is a masterpiece. Petroline runs from Saudi Arabia's eastern oil fields directly to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, covering the full width of the Arabian Peninsula underground. Its capacity is staggering, between 5 and 7 million barrels per day. According to the Congressional Research Service, the east-west pipeline has approximately 2.6 million barrels per day of available additional throughput capacity beyond current use. Yanbu is capable of exporting between 4 and 5 million barrels of crude per day through the Red Sea, ensuring that massive oil flows continue even if the Strait of Hormuz remains shut indefinitely. This is where things change. During the severe Hormuz crisis of 2026, Petroline proved its value to the entire world. The east-west pipeline enabled Saudi Arabia to maintain oil flows exceeding 5 million barrels per day, even as risks surrounding the Strait of Hormuz escalated, helping support global market stability at a moment of extreme uncertainty. Iran's mines, Iran's fast attack craft, Iran's missiles, none of them can reach a pipeline buried beneath the Saudi desert. And the Riyadh administration has ensured that by deploying some of the world's most advanced air and missile defense systems along the pipeline corridor. A potential Iranian missile, according to Saudi military officials, would be intercepted high in the sky long before it could threaten the line. Energy-hungry industrial giants like China can now purchase Saudi crude directly from Yanbu via the Red Sea. No Iran risk, no transit fees, no exposure to IRGC attack boats lurking in narrow waters. Iran's parliamentary speaker was still demanding a full ceasefire as a precondition for reopening the strait. On April 19th, Mohammad Reza Kouchi, head of the Iranian parliament's construction committee, announced that parliament was planning to pass a law requiring boats from hostile countries to pay tolls to pass through the strait. This is the language of desperation, not leverage. Because while Iran is writing toll laws for an empty strait, Saudi Arabia has already routed the world's cargo around it. What happens next? Now let's look at what is happening beyond Saudi Arabia's borders, because this story is bigger than one kingdom. The United Arab Emirates moved decisively. The ADCO pipeline, extending from the Habshan oil fields in Abu Dhabi to the port of Fujairah on the coast of the Gulf of Oman, bypasses Hormuz entirely. Fujairah is the world's third busiest refueling hub. The UAE can now export all of its oil to the open ocean without sending a single barrel through the contested strait. According to the Congressional Research Service, the UAE pipeline and Saudi Petroline together represent approximately 2.6 million barrels per day of available bypass capacity beyond current utilization. Abu Dhabi National Oil Company CEO Sultan Al Jaber stated on April 9th that even after a nominal ceasefire, the strait was still not open, and noted that 230 loaded oil tankers remained waiting inside the Gulf. The UAE was already ready to move. Iraq, too, is preparing its own answer to geography. The Development Road Project, starting from the Grand Fa port in Basra and extending all the way to Turkey, is a $24 billion mega project that amounts to nothing less than the Silk Road of the 21st century. A combined railway and highway network that will connect the Gulf directly to the Mediterranean and through it to the heart of Europe. Iraqi oil, Asian goods, European exports, all moving through a northern corridor that treats Hormuz as irrelevant. Turkey's strategic position transforms this into Europe's main gateway to the Gulf. A cargo loaded in Basra, according to project specifications, could travel by rail continuously to Istanbul and beyond. This is where most people miss it. Governments across the region, led by Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the UAE, are building a new trade architecture with multiple nodes linking the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. These new projects reflect what analysts describe as a structural shift in Middle East logistics, moving away from dependence on the established but vulnerable infrastructure of the Persian Gulf. The proposed alternative routes flow from Omani and Emirati ports outside the Persian Gulf, overland by rail through Saudi Arabia to Jordan, and onward through Egypt's Suez Canal, or the newly accessible Syrian ports of Latakia and Tartus. Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, the smaller Gulf states whose sea access has historically been entirely conditional on Hormuz remaining open, are now rapidly integrating into the network Saudi Arabia and the UAE have built. For the first time in their modern economic histories, these countries have genuine redundancy. They are not hostages of geography anymore. They have alternatives. And any Saudi Arabia's futuristic megacity project along the Red Sea coast, NEOM, is evolving into something far more immediate and practical than a vision board. The official NEOM company account posted a map showing corridors extending from European ports through Egypt's Damietta and Safaga to NEOM port, then branching overland toward Kuwait, Iraq, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, and Oman. Europe, Egypt, NEOM, Gulf, your fastest route. That is not a slogan. That is a new map of the world. But here's the problem. The Chatham House research briefing on the Iran war, published in May 2026, describes what is happening as a long-term reassessment of Saudi Arabia's economic geography. Saudi Arabia's two coastlines give it a significant geographical advantage over its neighbors that it will capitalize on to distinguish itself, especially from the UAE, as the region's main export and logistics hub. Saudi Aramco will need to reorient crude exports to achieve the equivalent of 7 million barrels per day flowing through the Red Sea to match pre-war export levels. It is currently moving approximately 4 million barrels per day, meaning the full potential of this westward shift is still being realized. Let's put this into numbers that clarify the full picture. Before the 2026 crisis, roughly 27% of the world's maritime crude oil trade passed through Hormuz. That is approximately 20 million barrels every single day. Saudi Arabia's Petroline has capacity for up to 7 million of those barrels to reroute entirely. The UAE pipeline adds another layer. Together, these two bypass routes alone can handle a significant share of Gulf energy exports without a single drop transiting Iranian-controlled waters. And as the Saudi Ports Authority confirmed, the combined annual container handling capacity of Saudi Red Sea ports exceeds 18.6 million TEUs, most of it historically underutilized, waiting for exactly this moment. Now here's the question that needs to be asked. What does Iran actually have left? This is where things change. Consider the reality. As of May 2026, tanker traffic through Hormuz has collapsed by more than 90%. The world's largest container lines have suspended operations through the strait indefinitely. MSC has just launched a dedicated bypass route endorsed by the most sophisticated logistics operators on Earth. Saudi Aramco is loading crude at Yanbu. The Saudi Ports Authority is running emergency logistics corridors, absorbing the trade of the entire GCC. China is diversifying its supply routes through Jeddah. Japan is strengthening direct energy ties to Saudi Red Sea ports. And President Trump launched Operation Project Freedom in May 2026 to begin escorting neutral ships out of the strait. The Iranian army can conduct exercises to close the strait. It can position fast attack craft. It can pass laws about tolls. But what it cannot do is threaten ships that are not there. The global maritime industry has begun to vote with its vessels, and it is voting for Riyadh. The old empire of fear, the one that caused oil prices to spike every time an Iranian general so much as looked at the strait, is collapsing in real time. Not because of military defeat alone, not because of sanctions alone, but because Saudi Arabia built a better road, because Riyadh made itself more valuable than the threat. What happens next? Abdul Latif Al-Mulim, writer and political and military analyst, explained that current developments are pushing Saudi Arabia to accelerate the linkage between the kingdom's eastern and western regions through a network of roads and railways connecting Dammam and Riyadh to Jeddah. These projects fall squarely within the priorities of Vision 2030. This is the pivot point, the moment where an economic transformation agenda and a geopolitical crisis intersect, and where the country that had planned ahead emerges with greater strength than it entered the crisis. Vision 2030. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's sweeping economic transformation plan always depended on diversifying Saudi Arabia away from oil dependence. But a crucial prerequisite for attracting global investment and becoming a three-continent logistics hub was proving that the kingdom could be relied upon as a stable, secure trade partner even in crisis. The Hormuz blockade was the ultimate stress test, and Saudi Arabia passed it. The kingdom did not benefit from the war in the traditional sense, but it benefited from its prior preparedness. Red Sea ports such as Jeddah Islamic Port and Yanbu helped maintain and redirect flows at a time when other countries faced bottlenecks. Ports that were underutilized are now operating at surge capacity. Logistics corridors that existed on paper are now moving millions of tons of cargo, and global investors watching this unfold are drawing the obvious conclusion about where to place their long-term bets. This is where most people miss it, but we cannot close this story without a clear-eyed look at the risks, because this picture is not purely triumphant. Iranian drones have already struck fuel depots and oil facilities near Red Sea ports. Iran responded to Israeli strikes by hitting Arab energy facilities, including the Samref refinery at the Saudi port of Yanbu. The port at Jeddah, hailed as a safe option, remains potentially within range of escalating Iranian aggression. Confidence in Red Sea route security was rebounding after Houthi attacks subsided, but the situation remains dynamic. The Wall Street Journal reported that Saudi Arabia is actually pressing the United States to end its blockade of the Strait of Hormuz and return to negotiations with Iran. A sign that even Riyadh is deeply aware that a prolonged escalation threatens the very Red Sea infrastructure it has built. Saudi Arabia and its allies want Washington to secure freedom of navigation, preserve stability in energy markets, and prevent Iran from using the strait as a geopolitical weapon. But without a wider war that could drag Red Sea shipping into the same inferno, the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow 21-mile passage that held the global economy hostage for decades, is slowly losing its grip. Not because the geography changed, because the world built around it. Saudi Arabia won one of the greatest geopolitical battles of this century without firing a single shot, without sending a single soldier to the front. It built roads, ports, and pipelines. It signed agreements with MSC, Maersk, and Hapag-Lloyd. It connected Jeddah to Shanghai, to Yokohama, to Hamburg, to Rotterdam. It ran Petroline at full capacity and redirected Aramco crude to Yanbu. And when the crisis finally arrived, the crisis that was supposed to bring the world to its knees, Riyadh opened its export door and kept the global economy moving. The triple logistical wall is complete. The 9-port global network, the MSC transcontinental hybrid corridor, and Petroline, the river of steel beneath the desert. 3 shields converging on a single conclusion, that Iran's greatest weapon has been reduced to a rusting sword with nothing left to cut. The remaining questions belong to the future, and they are not small ones. Will a cornered Iran resort to deeper proxy attacks on Red Sea infrastructure? Will the dual blockade resolve in a diplomatic agreement, or escalate into the next chapter of conflict? And will the structural shifts now underway in global logistics become permanent, locking in Saudi Arabia's new role as the connective tissue of world trade long after the last mine is cleared from the Strait of Hormuz? We are watching this story in real time, and the world is changing with it.